Hey friends, we're finishing up chapter 6. Okay, let's hop back in right where we left off. But please don't distress yourself on our behalf. You know you don't like looking on the dark planets, and that's very upsetting to us when you aren't happy. But I must know what happens to the children, the medium said. It's my worst trouble, getting fond. If I didn't get fond, I could be happy all the time. Oh, well, ho-hum. I managed to keep pretty jolly, and a little snooze will do wonders for me right now. Goodbye, everybody. And her words got lost in the general buzz of a snore. Come, Miss Witch ordered, and they followed her out of the darkness of the cave to the impersonal grayness of the medium's planet. Now, children, you must not be frightened at what is going to happen, Mrs. Witch warned. Stay angry, little Meg, Mrs. Whatsit whispered. You will need all of your anger now. Without warning, Meg was swept into nothingness again. This time, the nothingness was interrupted by a feeling of clammy coldness, such that she had never felt before. The coldness deepened and swirled all about her and through her, and was filled with a new and strange kind of darkness that was a completely tangible thing. A thing that wanted to eat and digest her like some enormous, malignant beast of prey. But then the darkness was gone. It had been the shadow, the black thing. Had they had to travel through it to get to her father? There was the by now familiar tingling in her hands and feet, and the push through hardness, and she was on her feet, breathless but unharmed, standing beside Calvin and Charles Wallace. Is this Camazotz? Charles Wallace asked Mrs. Whatsit, materialized in front of him. Yes, she answered. Now, let us stand and get our breath and look around. They were standing on a hill as Meg looked about her. She felt that it could easily be a hill on earth. There were familiar trees she knew so well at home, birches, pines, and maples. And though it was warmer than it had been when they so precipitously left the apple orchard, there was a faintly autumnal touch to the air. Near them were several small trees with reddened leaves, very like sumac, and a big patch of goldenrod, like flowers. As she looked down the hill, she could see the smokestacks of a town. It might have been one of any number of familiar towns. There seemed to be nothing strange or different or frightening in the landscape. But Mrs. Whatsit came to her and put an arm around her comfortingly. I can't stay here with you, love, she said. You three children will be on your own. We will be near you. We will be watching you. But you will not be able to see us or ask us for help. And we will not be able to come to you. But is Father here? Meg asked, trembling. Yes. But where? When we see him? She was poised for running, as though she were going to sprint off immediately to wherever her father was. That I cannot tell you. You will have to wait until the precipitous moment. Charles Wallace looked steadily at Mrs. Whatsit. Are you afraid for us? A little. But if you weren't afraid to do what you did when you were a star, why should you be afraid for us now? I was afraid, Mrs. Whatsit said gently. She looked steadily at each of the three children in turn. You will need help, she told them. But all I am allowed to give you is a little talisman. Calvin, your great gift is your ability to communicate with all kinds of people. So for you, I will strengthen this gift. Meg, I will give you your faults. My faults? Meg cried. Your faults. But I'm always trying to get rid of my faults. Yes, Mrs. Whatsit said. However, I think you'll find they'll come in very handy on Camazotz. Charles Wallace, to you, I can only give the resiliency of your childhood. From somewhere, Mrs. Who's glasses glimmered, and they heard her voice. Calvin, she said, a hint for you, a hint. Listen well. For that he was a spirit too delicate to act their earthly and abhorrent commands, refusing their grand heist, they did confine him by help of their most potent ministers and in their most unmitigable rage into cloven pine, within which rift, imprisoned, he did painfully remain. Shakespeare, The Tempest. Where are you, Mrs. Who? Charles Wallace asked. Where is Mrs. Witch? We cannot come to you now. Mrs. Witch's voice blew to them on a wind. She speaks something in German, and it says, I do not know everything. Still many things I understand. That is for you, Charles. Remember that you do not know everything. Then the voice was directed to Meg. To you I leave my glasses, a little blind as a bat, but do not use them except as a last resort. Save them for the final moments of peril. As she spoke, there was another shimmer of spectacles, and then it was gone, and the voice faded out with it. The spectacles were in Meg's hands. She put them carefully into the breast pocket of her blazer, and the knowledge that they were there somehow made her a little less afraid. To all three of you I give my command, Mrs. Witch said. Go down into the town. Go together. Do not let them separate you. Be strong. There was a flicker, and then it vanished. Meg shivered. Mrs. Whatsit must have seen the shiver, for she patted Meg on the shoulder. Then she turned to Calvin. Take care of Meg. I can take care of Meg, Charles Wallace said rather sharply. I always have. Mrs. Whatsit looked at Charles Wallace, and the creaky voice somehow both to soften and to deepen at the same time. Charles Wallace, the danger here is greatest for you. Why? Because of what you are. Just exactly because what you are, you will be by far the most vulnerable. You must stay with Meg and Calvin. You must not go off on your own. Beware of pride and arrogance, Charles, for they may betray you. At the tone of what Mrs. Whatsit's voice, both warning and frightening, Meg shivered again. And Charles Wallace butted up against Mrs. Whatsit in a way he often did with his mother, whispering, Now I think I know what you meant about being afraid. Only a fool is not afraid, Mrs. Whatsit told him. Now go. And where she had been, there was only sky and grass and a small rock. Come on, Meg said impatiently. Come on, let's go. She was completely unaware that her voice was trembling like an aspen leaf. She took Charles Wallace and Calvin each by the hand and started down the hill. Below them, the town was laid out in a harsh, angular patterns. The houses in the outskirts were all exactly alike, small square boxes painted gray. Each had a small rectangular plot of lawn in front, with a straight line and dull-looking flowers edging the path to the door. Meg had a feeling that if she could count the flowers, there would be exactly the same number for each house. In front of all the houses, children were playing. Some were skipping rope, some were bouncing balls. Meg felt vaguely that something was wrong with their play. It seemed like the children playing around any housing developments at home, yet there was something different about it. She looked at Calvin and saw he too was puzzled. Look, Charles Wallace said suddenly, they're skipping and bouncing in rhythm. Everyone's doing it at the exact same moment. This was so, and the skipping rope hit the pavement, so did the ball. As the rope curved over the head of the jumping child with the ball caught the ball. Down came the ropes, down came the balls, over and over again. Up, down, all in rhythm, all identical, like all the houses, like the path, like the flowers. Then the doors of all the houses opened simultaneously and came out women like a row of paper dolls. The print of their dresses were different, but they all gave the appearance of being the same. Each woman stood on the top step of her house. Each clapped. Each child with the ball caught the ball Each child with the skipping rope folded the rope. Each child turned and walked into the house. The doors clicked shut behind them. How can they do it? Meg asked wonderingly. We couldn't do that if we tried. What does that mean? Let's go back. Calvin's voice was urgent. Back? Charles Wallace asked. Where? I don't know. Anywhere. Back to the hill. Back to Mrs. Whatson and Mrs. Who and Mrs. Which. I don't like this.